I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this session called Carbon Dividends, a Consensus Climate Solution. Now, I was with Mike Bloomberg a few weeks ago on the night that the news broke that Trump had decided to pull out of the Paris Accord. And there was initially a moment of shock. And then over dinner, Bloomberg and a number of big American CEOs sat there and told me that actually the focus on what Trump was doing with the Paris Accord was something of a red herring and distraction. Because these days, according to people like Bloomberg, the real action on climate change is not actually sitting in the federal government. It's actually sitting at cities, at local levels, inside corporations. It's about the decisions that people are taking on the ground and how they're networking with each other to try and push forward the climate change debate, or rather climate change action. And what we're going to be hearing about today is a very interesting set of ideas that have come out from the group that Tett Halstead oversees, now in collaboration with a number of big stakeholders and partners from around the world, trying to promote a novel or new idea to tackle climate change, not from the big government area, not from necessarily the realm of left-wing politics, and much of the climate change debate has been dominated by, but instead by looking at markets-based solutions. So what we're going to do is hear a quick précis of the idea, and then hear why some of the other partners who've come on board have decided to come on board with this idea. I'll then have some questions, and we'll open it up to a wider debate. And we're very keen to get a whole range of opinions on these ideas, because frankly, we need a new approach now more than ever. And so, Ted, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gillian. Thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. So last week marked the culmination of a year-long effort to do two things. One, to develop a consensus climate solution in which all key factions in the US climate debate could realize an important victory. And second of all, to build a novel coalition in support of that includes a number of surprising voices. We're going to put up the first slide, if we could, to show you, no, the other slide. Thank you. To show you the coalition that we have brought together. And as you'll see, it includes 11 of the largest companies in the world, including 4 of the oil majors. It includes several of the leading environmental organizations in the world, including the Nature Conservancy represented by Mark. And if you look at the opinion leaders behind it, I mean, we have, and the initial co-authors, Baker and Schulz, we have 2 former Republican secretaries of state. We have involved in the project 4 former Treasury secretaries. Quite the unusual coalition. So why has this group come together? Well, it's come together out of a sense that we need a breakthrough climate solution that bridges the partisan divide and that can overcome the seemingly insurmountable barriers to progress. Let's put up the other slide for a moment. This is the statement that our founding members came up with last week when we announced this. And as you'll see, the plan is built on 4 pillars. The first is a gradually rising carbon tax. Now, for 20 years, economists have been telling us that a carbon tax is the most effective way to solve climate change. But by itself, a carbon tax has proven to be unpopular and a political dead end. So that is why our plan is not really a carbon tax, it's a carbon dividends plan. And I want to emphasize that heavily, because calling our plan a carbon tax is akin to calling Social Security a payroll tax, right? If Franklin Delano Roosevelt had said, you know, back in his heyday, I have this grand plan for reinventing the American social contract, and it's a payroll tax, he would have gotten nowhere. Instead, he sold retirement security. What we're proposing here is a new carbon dividend to the American people. 100% of the revenue from the carbon tax would go directly back to the American people in the form of equal monthly dividends. And the numbers are significant. A family of 4 would receive about $2,000 per year. And more significant still, the Treasury Department found that the bottom 70% of Americans would benefit economically from this policy, meaning that they would receive more in dividends than they would pay in increased energy costs. And if you just pause there for a moment, what that means is that 223 million Americans would actually win economically from solving climate change, which is rather revolutionary. The third pillar of our program is a rollback of carbon regulations that are no longer necessary. Our basic belief, and this is what makes us a conservative approach to climate policy, is that markets are more effective than government. And this plan is built on the conservative philosophy of small government and free markets. And once that we have a powerful market incentive, we don't need a lot of the carbon regulations. And why don't we need them? Because our plan would achieve nearly twice the emissions reductions of all Obama-era climate regulations combined. And our plan by itself, this is starting at $40 per ton, a carbon tax, would achieve the high end of America's commitment under Paris, all by itself. So if you just think back for a minute, you're going to hear after me from ExxonMobil and then from the Nature Conservancy. But here we have all these large companies, including 4 oil majors, backing a plan that is nearly twice as ambitious as all of the Obama-era regulations combined. The final pillar of our plan, as you'll see, is a border carbon adjustment to level the playing field and to promote American competitiveness. And simply put, any country that would adopt this plan would combine it with policies to charge a tax on imports from countries that do not have comparable carbon pricing, and likewise, we would rebate the tax paid to companies exporting to such countries. What this would create is a new climate domino effect. Hopefully we can go into that more during question and answer. But the key point here is this is a whole new strategy to reach a global price on carbon, quite distinct from the Paris path, which is still very important. But this is a whole new way through unilateral action, getting a leading country or region to adopt this system, and that would create a strong incentive for other countries to follow suit. With that, let me move on.
Well, that's fascinating. Before we move on, though, I mean, my role as a journalist is often to be a sort of well-meaning idiot and to ask really basic questions about how things actually work. What does it mean in practice? Are you suggesting essentially that if we are importing stuff from, say, China, which has a lot of smokestack industries and coal, polluting factories and stuff, are you suggesting that we basically slap on extra taxes from China, but conversely, if we're importing things from Denmark, the land of clean energy, that there wouldn't be such high taxes? I mean, how would it actually work in practice? Explain to the audience what it means in terms of their lives.
Right. So the way the border carbon adjustment would work is it's not some random tariff. It is, and it would be entirely WTO compliant. It is a fee based on the carbon content of imports from countries that do not have the same level of carbon taxation. And yes, in the case of China, this would correct one of the main flaws of current trade policy, which is, if you think about it today, current trade policy implies an implicit subsidy to dirty manufacturing overseas, because economists have always known that we're failing to take social and environmental costs into account. This would do that. It would do it in a way that would level the playing field, and it would do it in a way that would promote clean technology in all countries. But what would happen in practice is that if the United States led, or Europe led, or China could even lead, China is actually getting increasingly interested because of its own cap and trade system in border carbon adjustments. This is about harmonizing up and using trade policy to do so in a manner that's WTO compliant. But it would never really go to WTO contention, because what would happen in practice, let's say the US adopted this system, Canada and Europe would follow quickly. You'd end up quickly with a carbon club, and therefore the world would quickly move up to the same level of carbon taxation. So this is a new strategy that is WTO compliant and that has the support, as we've pointed out, of, among our group, 4 former US Secretaries of Treasury, including Martin Feldstein and Greg Mankiw, two of the 2 most respected Republican economists of our era. So these are serious people backing a whole new policy, which includes a rethink of trade policy to make it more compatible with climate goals.
So, I mean, again, just before I go to the reaction, just to again tease out some of the logistics of this, I love the word carbon club. It makes me think instead of calling it the G7 or G20, we should have the C7 or C20 or whatever else. But question 1 is there any indication whatsoever that the administration of Donald Trump is willing to adopt this? Has Trump tweeted on this yet?
So there is a lot of interest in the White House in this policy. When we first announced this in February, the first thing that we did after our press conference is that Secretary of State James Baker, Mankiw Feldstein, and I went to the White House, met with Gary Cohn. The meeting got a lot of publicity. We've been in regular touch with the White House on this. And I would say that there is a non-trivial chance that this White House will come around to this policy. Because hopefully we'll get to this more in question and answer. There are so many pressures on not just this administration, but the country as a whole to lead on climate policy. And very briefly, it's coming from companies where there's a close to a unified position wanting to stay in Paris and lead on climate. It's coming from institutional investors. It's coming from voters. 71% of Americans wanted to stay in Paris, and the majority of Americans, even larger majority, want clean power. It's also coming from our international partners. And finally, of course, it's coming from facts on the ground. Right. My thesis to you is this, is that although many people are depressed about the repeal-only strategy of this White House, what is going to happen sooner rather than later is a breaking of this logjam, because all 5 of those factors are pushing in the same direction. And when that dam breaks, it will not be an incremental policy that we will get. It will be a systemic policy change of the type that we're talking about. And the final thing I'll say is that what this group is coalescing around is the idea that whenever it happens, we can't say when, we can say whether, this will be the inevitable climate policy in the US, because it's the only one where all factions in the debate, as you're about to hear, can get behind.
And just lastly, so administration not on board yet, but you think there's a non-trivial chance they will be due to public pressure and corporate pressure, which I'll come to in a moment. The key question, though, is can any of this happen without the administration? Do you need to have the administration on board? Because it seems to me you do.
Yes, in the short term we do. And if you, I mean, let's just listen, since you asked me again, I'll go another minute then. Since when President Trump backed out of Paris, he said, it's not that we don't want to have a climate plan and we're open to renegotiating. He said, we're backing out because we want a plan that is pro-growth, that is pro-jobs, that helps American workers, and that prevents our allies from taking advantage of us. This plan, as you see, meets all of those tests, and there will be increasing pressure on this White House. So yes, we need the White House, and it may have to wait until 2020. It may be that in the meantime, other countries lead the way and we follow. But again, there's a non-trivial chance that this White House comes around because there's so much pressure.
Right, okay. Well, I'd be very curious to hear from the audience what you think about this and to ask some other questions in a moment. But before I do, though, I'd like to ask, why has Exxon got on board? Because you've not been seen as a flag-waving evangelist for clean energy in recent years, always. You might beg to disagree, but why have you decided to get involved in this project? What attracts you to it?
Okay, Gillian, thanks for having me. It's good to be here today. Yeah, I might dispute your characterization there a little bit. Let me just take a step back to widen the lens a little bit to explain why, and this may seem counterintuitive to some people in the room, why a company like ours would be on the list that you saw earlier. When we look at this space, we see a dual challenge, right? We're an oil and gas company, so our primary challenge is to provide the energy that the world needs every day. But there's a challenge that comes with that, which is what do you do about the climate challenge and rising CO2 emissions? And for the better part of a decade, our company has looked at various solutions in the technology space, but also in the policy space, and so I'll limit the discussion right now to the policy space. And we looked at the options for what do you do in the policy space to address it. We have supported a revenue-neutral carbon tax as the most appropriate, most efficient way of trying to tackle emissions for a lot of the reasons that Tett articulates, and we can talk a little bit more about that if we want to get into the wonky weeds on tax policy. But back in February, when there was an op-ed piece in I think it was the Wall Street Journal, co-authored by Secretaries Schulz and Baker, talking about a solution, a policy solution, and it outlined the principles that Ted talked about in the strategic approach. We looked at that and we said, hey, that actually looks a lot like what we've been talking about as we've looked at the issue for a number of years now. So not that long after that, we got in touch with Ted. Ted's a fairly persuasive fellow, as I hope many of you in the audience can see. And with a good back and forth and a good dialogue about what Ted and Secretaries Schulz and Baker had in mind, we looked at this and said, hey, this looks promising. This looks along the lines of what we have been supporting. and backing for quite some time. And I'll just highlight two things. One is, Ted talked about you have a carbon tax in lieu of all the other regulations that are in place that are designed to address greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not maybe widely appreciated in the United States just how much regulation there is in this space. There's quite a bit. And the problem is that you have this, it's almost a sort of Byzantine, very balkanized system addressing a very real problem, but not doing it in a very efficient, effective, or way, and it's actually quite costly to do it this way. So if you swap that out, if you have kind of policy rationalization here, that's a win-win situation for everybody. So that was one of the key things that we were interested in when we supported it.
So Nick, that's obviously very interesting. I'm curious, I mean, Exxon has formidable lobbying muscle in Washington. Your own former CEO is now in a very elevated position. Do you think that you coming on board can help that corporate lobbying in favor of this kind of initiative? And what do you plan to do to actually try and persuade the White House to adopt this idea?
Well, so I'd say a couple things. One is, as we look at the state of play on the policy and political front today, there's still quite a bit of education in this space that needs to happen. First of all, when you propose a tax of any kind, taxes just aren't popular. People don't, it's not just the Republican Party that's opposed to taxes generally. Taxes of any kind, new taxes especially, are just not, they're never going to be politically popular. So Ted's innovation here is to try to tackle that, try to crack that political nut. So one of the things that we see happening is an avenue for talking to people who've been very, their ears have been closed in this space and saying, okay, what is it that we're actually looking at trying to do? You're trying to solve a genuine problem, and you're trying to do it in a way that doesn't tank the economy, which is a legitimate concern that people would have about a heavy regulatory approach or taxes. And you're seeing interest in this. You're seeing interest in carbon taxes. I would say the conversation about policy in this space has gotten much better over the last decade. There have been a lot of approaches that I don't think were very good policy approaches, say 10 years ago. And I think the level of discussion about this, the intelligence about it, about what's good, about what's an appropriate approach, it has much improved. And I think what the Climate Leadership Council is doing is advancing that.
And do you think that Tillerson supports this idea?
I don't know. I haven't talked to him about it, although interestingly, Secretary Tillerson was supportive of Paris and staying in Paris, as we were, and a number of other companies were. I know Mark and the Nature Conservancy and others were. That didn't carry the day, and I know there was a lot of kind of rending of garments over that and concern about what that meant, but I don't think that's the end of the story. It may actually be the beginning of the story in terms of what we're talking about and what might actually work, what's practical, and what might actually be effective going forward.
Right. Well, I'm curious, the Nature Conservancy doesn't often sit on a panel together with Exxon. What has persuaded you to get on board this?
Okay, it's nice to be here, everyone. Yeah, for me, this is pretty straightforward. We're a science-based environmental organization, and we view climate change as the greatest threat to our mission. And we think it's really important that the U.S. be a leader. And what we have to do in the U.S. and globally is reduce the greenhouse gas emissions as fast as possible and in as big a way as possible. So we got to move fast, we got to move big. So we're interested in anything that can make that happen. We also have always believed that a price on carbon is the best way to do that. All economists agree. It's not the only way. And if we can't have a price on carbon, we are in favor of the other ways to do it. But a price on carbon is likely the way to achieve these emission reductions at the lowest possible cost. So that should make it possible to move faster and bigger. That's what, again, our eye is always on that ball if we want to reduce emissions. Then we have to think about politics. And at the Nature Conservancy, we're global, but we'll just talk about the US. We happen to have a chapter in every state. Each has a board of trustees. So we've got red states and blue states, just like the Congress. And so one of my jobs is to build that red state support. So we're trying to build bipartisan support for all of our programs, including addressing climate. So again, a price on carbon, a carbon tax, has a benefit. And Ted and his team have really, as you can tell, emphasized why this should appeal to conservatives. It allows, ultimately, if it's successful, for the grab bag of regulations that we otherwise use to go away in favor of this market-based mechanism. So it actually, conservatives should like this. It shrinks government. And then the dividend is an interesting idea too, because by the way, the carbon tax is proposed to start at $40 a ton. That's to us is an attractive starting point. This is not a wimpy carbon tax, and importantly, it grows. And then the dividend is interesting because I'm not a political scientist, but you can imagine then, again, we want voters on our side. Voters might like growing dividends over time, so we have a political constituency for this. So we think it's a really well-designed proposal. We like the diverse members in it. It's great that Exxon's at the table. It's great that Republican thought leaders like George Schulz and Jim Baker are there, but it's also great that Larry Summers is there. What else should I say? I don't know that I'm as optimistic about Tett as the likelihood of her success in the near term with the current administration, but we're all for that. We're going to definitely do everything we can to make that happen, but we're not sitting around waiting either. We're going to do everything we can. So we had 200 trustees from TNC in DC last week, 250 meetings on the Hill with senators and Republicans of all of them, from all states, all parties. And they are listening. I don't know if the White House is maybe listening, maybe not. The Congress is listening. There's a caucus in the Congress right now, the climate, what's it called?
Solutions Caucus.
It's 23 and 23 as of today.
Yeah, see, growing. Thank you, Greg. So 23 Republicans, 23 Democrats. So things are moving this way. But in the meantime, we're not sitting tight. So we also are, a lot of actions at the states right now. And in some states, like Oregon and Washington, it's talk about a carbon tax. So maybe it'll happen there first. We can use these principles there. We need to reduce emissions. And we also have to think globally, too. But we think it's vital that the U.S. be a leader. And we think what's great about this proposal is this ought to be a way to bring all parties together, speaking openly about climate change. That is good. There are a lot of details to work out. Fine, one step at a time. Maybe the policy morphs a little bit, maybe not. But we want Republicans, Democrats, red states, blue states, business, NGOs, policy thought leaders in the game. And we're very pleased, therefore, to be part of this.
Right. Well, you've just had a good précis of what the proposal is and why a range of actors are getting on board. I'm curious, I'd just like to ask the audience whether your sales pitch has worked. How many of you in the room think that this sounds like a good idea? Okay. How many of you think that actually there are better ways to go around dealing with climate change? One. Okay. Well, she gets a medal for bravery straight away. Well, you've certainly got a very convinced audience here. You've done a good job in convincing them.
But Marianne Smart, we're going to have to hear from her.
Okay, well, it's one reason why I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions here, because I think, as you say, part of your challenge is going to be education, explaining it, and building a wider consensus. But I'd also like to hear from the dissenter about what's wrong with the plan. But what are the next tangible steps? I mean, what should we be looking for in terms of trying to drive this forward next?
Well, let's start with you guys, and then I'll go.
Okay, so TNC, we're trying to do everything we can, and if people have additional ideas of what we can do, we welcome them. We're trying to mobilize, in the U.S., we're trying to mobilize all of our constituents to engage in politics. Politics has become less popular in America recently, but democracy takes hard work. So that's my ask of all of you. We want everybody to engage in politics at the federal, state, and local level. What I've learned, I've only been in this business now, 9 years, but I was a business person. I do have to go to Capitol Hill. I actually think elected officials listen to their constituents. Constituents don't show up enough and talk wisely about what they're looking for. So we need to be in the game. That's the big thing we're trying to do. And again, this program unlocks an opportunity, I think, for Republicans or red state supporters of TNC to more comfortably engage on the tough topic. We get that. It's a tough topic in some places. You can talk about climate change. You've got the halo of George Schulz and Jim Baker behind you. You've got really good economic thinking, and you've got organizations like us to support it. But people have to get to work and let our elected officials know that we need to make urgent progress here.
Right. What is your next step?
Well, a couple of things. One of the things that we're doing as a founding member is working with Ted and his team on, at sort of the technical level. I mean, one of the things that will come forward over time, there are a lot of pieces to this in terms of what legislation might look like or how it all shakes out. So we'll be working with the CLC on that. And in the meantime, there's been a lot of interest in our having signed on to this, so we're getting a lot of questions. We have companies coming to us and saying, hey, it's interesting you guys joined this effort. What do we need to know about it? Why were you interested in it? Why did you get behind it? Why did you join as a founding member? So we're spending a lot of time talking to others who are saying, hey, maybe there's something interesting here worth pursuing. So we'll be following up with that.
What about you, Ted? What's your game plan? What's your summer look like?
Sure. Well, first of all, having allies like this is a dream, so I couldn't be happier about that. So we're going to move forward on a number of fronts. One, we're going to grow the coalition. These are 11 companies that had the courage to lead the way, but we imagine that over time we'll have hundreds of companies backing this, again, to turn it into the inevitable climate solution. Second of all, we're going to be developing the policy details. As you saw before, we have a plan that is based on 4 clear pillars, but within each pillar, there's a new level of policy detail that needs to be worked out. And so our founding members will be at the table with us in developing that. We think it'll take, somewhere between a year to 2 years to develop it to the point where it's legislatively mature. On the other hand, if the White House wants to introduce it next week, we'll have a plan for them next week. But anyway, so policy development is number 2. Public education is key. But then another thing that we're going to do is internationalize this plan, because as much as we all want the United States to lead, and as hard as we will all push for the White House and Congress to lead on this issue, we should hedge our bets. So we're very interested in moving this idea in the United Kingdom, where we just established a partnership with Theresa May's key think tank Policy Exchange and Oxford University. We're interested in moving this in France, where President Macron wants to be a climate leader. In Germany, we just hired a superb staffer to help develop our China policy. And China, we've already heard indications they want to work with us on border carbon adjustments. Our strategy of change here is to find a country or region to pioneer the system. And with border carbon adjustments, that creates a new domino effect. So whether it starts in Europe, in Asia, or in the States, to us, it's a little bit indifferent. We would prefer the United States, but if America is not going to lead, other countries will, and America will follow. And, again, one needs to think in changes of this magnitude, there's a temptation in the media to focus on sort of such a short-term ballgame of, will this Congress pass it? And there are actually some Republican members of Congress who have expressed interest in this. But let's be realistic. This Congress is not likely to, adopt this plan tomorrow. But nevertheless, we're going to work that. And it may take another election or 2 for this issue to be completely ripe in the United States. But in other countries, it could move tomorrow. And that's what makes it interesting, is that this is a strategy where we have a lot of sandboxes to play in, and we'll be moving aggressively in all of those.
But would Macron really pick up a sort of made in America plan like this?
I'm so
is
happy.
Angela Merkel keen to get on board?
I'm so happy you asked. So when the CEO of Total, Patrick Pouyanné, a great guy, was interviewed last week, because we came out with our coalition, we announced this last Tuesday, in Le Monde, the top French paper. His whole interview was about how this should be the plan for France. It doesn't really matter in policy where the idea came from. What matters is that it's a good idea. And then he went a step further. If only all of our CEOs would do this. He tweeted very publicly to Macron and his environmental minister, Hulot, and said, this is the plan for France, please respond. And so we are now inviting them to an event in New York with the World Economic Forum. We'll see if they accept. But yes, we think this does have a real traction there. One thing I want to mention just for a moment is that for all the attention on Paris, there's a basic problem we're not addressing, which is that there is not a single leading country in the world that is on track to reduce emissions at the required scale and speed. Whether it's Germany that is now having trouble from a climate perspective because of their nuclear pullback, or other countries, every leading country is stuck and lacks a winning, coherent way forward. So we think that there's great potential all over, and yes, very much in France.
Right. Well, I'd like to turn to the audience now for questions, because I think it should be a debate and dialogue. And since we are in danger of slipping into a bit of a cozy consensus here, I'd like to ask whether the lady who put her hand up and dissented could perhaps ask the first question and explain why she doesn't think this is such a great idea.
Hi, my name is Marianne Hitt. I work for the Sierra Club. I direct the Beyond Coal campaign, and I might reframe it. I love a price on carbon. I think any climate activist worth their salt supports a price on carbon. And I don't know if I would say that this is a better approach, but it's complementary is maybe the way I would put it instead. The campaign that I am leading is 100 organizations around the United States that have secured the retirement of half of the coal-fired power plants in the United States, which are our biggest source of carbon pollution. And they have done that through working at the local level where decisions are made about how we make electricity to close air pollution and water pollution loopholes. So if a coal plant is spilling coal ash into the river, if it doesn't have air pollution controls and kids nearby are getting asthma, it has been, those environmental regulations have been an important tool for us because it's often low-income communities, communities of color that are hit hardest by pollution. And if the coal plant won't abide by the rules of the road, we rely on those regulations as a backstop. And so the plank in here about removing the carbon regulations is the one I wanted to ask you all about, because I do think that it would kind of tie one hand behind our back as advocates. If the carbon tax is working, if it's high enough, if everybody's cooperating, that's great. But what happens if it isn't working, or if it's getting lowered, or some other sort of political mischief is happening and we don't have the regulations anymore as a backstop? So that would be my question.
Yeah, so is the excitement about this plan going to essentially be a distraction from the other work that you're doing at the grassroots?
Well, more than that, I agree with Marianne's concern, and I really admire Marianne's led and her team at Sierra Club have done great work on the putting coal back. Marianne's question is a really important one, and it had a lot to do with the Nature Conservancy joining this coalition. So, at the kind of the headline level, imagining a carbon tax that works in place of all these regulations sounds kind of good. And of course, you can understand why that might excite business that finds the myriad of regulations right now suboptimal, et cetera. As environmentalists, again, what we're focused on is we need emission reductions, period. And we can't take any risk. So to the extent there's a trade for any current regulations for this new carbon price, it would have to be achieved with exceeding care. So we want a seat at the table, and Ted will remember our first conversation, and it's the first question I asked, and Ted said, yes, the Nature Conservancy, you can be part of the team, and we're talking to other NGOs already too, to ensure that there are enforcement mechanisms to make sure we don't incur the risks that Marianne is wisely identifying. And Ted also agreed if we were dissatisfied with where the coalition was going, then the Nature Conservancy could create a huff, leave with headlines, and the coalition won't work. So, none of this is easy, but I would argue strongly that's no reason not to engage in this important dialogue, because we do know that the regulations we're using right now, and we're glad that we have them, they're much better than nothing. It's also true they're not getting the job done. We have a long way to go, so we got to do both things at once.
So you're committed to being the awkward squad and making sure it doesn't get forgotten? The other
No,
stuff
it's absolutely mandatory to any environmentalist worth his salt.
If I could build on that, I'd just like to round out the story a little bit on what's happened with electricity generation in this country in recent history. And part of it is coal retirements of coal plants that reached a certain age, but part of it is also that there was a technology revolution that's happened that's enabled that or facilitated that. Some of that's happened in this state, as a matter of fact. And the shale revolution, which has led to this enormous endowment of natural gas, has led to this gradual transformation of the electricity sector in the United States. And that's a story of markets, and that's part of what is so attractive about the CLC's approach, is that its reliance on markets, not picking winners or losers in the marketplace, but setting up a structure so that there's competition and that technology and markets drive solutions for people. So I just wanted to highlight again what's attractive about the CLC approach and why we think it may be effective.
Yeah, sure.
I want to speak to this because it's the key point for environmental groups, and I'm so glad you brought it up as the first question. But let me just for a moment step way back for a second. The normal story in the media is that Democrats care about climate and Republicans don't. I think that suffers from a fundamental confusion between means and ends. If you focus on ends, all parties, all leaders from both parties agree we want a healthy climate for our children and grandchildren. Where the radical disagreement is on means. And Republicans for so long have rejected the democratic means or the environmental means of heavy-handed regulation, which they consider to be growth inhibiting. So what's revolutionary about our plan is that it is achieving very strong environmental results through conservative means. And the reason the regulatory rollback is so important is because without it, you don't get Republicans on board. And in fact, you won't get a lot of the businesses on board. So it's a key part of our strategy. But that being said, the only justification for this is that the emissions gains would be considerably greater. Our study, when we released this, showed that the emissions gains reductions under our plan would be nearly twice all the regulations they would replace. WRI, one of our strategic partners, just came out with a study saying, hey, they would be even greater than that, meaning more than 2x all Obama-era regs. And to your point, we want to make this safe, and we're doing it in two ways. One, we're working with all of our partners on a concept called environmental integrity mechanisms, to be defined, but this is a core area, and that is how can we ensure that the environmental reductions, the emissions reductions occur, and create a backstop for if they don't. The other thing which is important, and which I'll just mention from the get-go, is that we have decided consciously not to accept corporate money, because we want to be the honest broker between all the sides in the debate. And that's why it was so important for us to bring on organizations like the Nature Conservancy or Conservation International or WRI from the beginning. And just as our business, the business members of our coalition will expand, so will the environmental members of our coalition. Because if we can't find a plan that everybody is comfortable with and thinks is a big step forward, we're not going to succeed.
Well, I can see a lot of, in fact, almost more handsome people in the room right now. But let me take the lady with the blue jacket who's been waving faithfully for a long time.
Sylvia Earle.
Sylvia Earle here, the National Geographic and Aspen trustee. My question is primarily to you, Mark. This is fascinating and I think really important and necessary to consider how we go about reducing emissions. At the same time, especially looking at Nature Conservancy, protecting the engine that naturally captures carbon, and what we've been doing over the ages to destroy forests, and now with increasing attention to what's happening to the ocean, where again, by the large-scale extraction of ocean wildlife, it's affecting the carbon cycle. Just to what extent the political and economic solutions that you're addressing here can be complemented by the other side of the equation, which is protecting the systems that naturally capture carbon, sequester carbon, and maintain a planet that works in our favor, given that it's really in trouble.
Yep.
Great question.
Yeah, thank you for asking, Sylvia, and thanks for being here. Everybody knows Sylvia, one of my heroes. I would say the most important stuff we're doing at the Nature Conservancy right now, not easy, but most important, is we call it natural climate solutions. We want to take restoring nature to scale. Our scientists have concluded, independent of important efforts like this, as much as a third of what the globe needs to accomplish per the Paris Accord can be done by restoration of nature, and it can be done on a cost-competitive basis. So imagine huge degraded forests in Brazil being restored, and they'd probably need to be timber or agriculture models. You can't do this with philanthropy. And so this will be complicated but hugely important. So we imagine mobilizing government aid that's already been committed in connection with climate, impact capital, so below market terms as kind of intermediate capital, commercial capital, and doing big projects at scale, starting with forests, because that's where the most carbon is, but ultimately including all ecosystems. And you know, frankly, without this kind of progress, it's hard to imagine us succeeding in climate. You'll read all the time, like about a week or two ago, Sweden said by 2035, they want to be at net zero emissions. Not zero emissions, net zero emissions. So of course, there'll still be use of fossil fuel in Sweden. So it's programs like this that will have to be available at scale to offset carbon. And then what's great about it is it's really one of these win-win-win-win things. So imagine restoring forests, so good for climate, good for watersheds, good for biodiversity, good for the communities that live there. Also affordable, low cost, and it can be done all around the world. So we're proud to be a part of this. We think, especially right now, US policy leadership is important. But yes, our origins are as a nature conservation organization, and we hope to take restoring nature to scale to sequester carbon. One last comment, though. As excited as we are about restoring nature, we can't forget about protecting nature. I mentioned Brazil, probably the place where we've had the most success protecting forests, and all that success is a little bit at risk right now. Brazil's economy is on the skids, the currency's down, they have all these political challenges, soy prices are up, and so there's a lot of pressure in Brazil right now to clear forests and grow soy farming. We've got to resist this. So by that I mean to say, none of this is easy. We have a lot of work to do. But back to the CLC, I think this is an important underpinning. And Sylvia, though, you're exactly right. Good old Mother Nature is got to play a heroic role here, too.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, next question. We've got a question over there, and then we'll go over that side. And I should have said before, it would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself. Just over there. And thank you, for Sylvia, for doing that before.
Yes, my name is Priscilla Newman. I'm from New York. And last night we watched Chasing Coral, which gave me a real sense of urgency. And I'm wondering if it might not be more effective at this point or more expedient to work with the governors in the United States and local entities to accomplish some of these goals, rather than waiting for the Trump administration to organize itself.
I'll just say quickly, we're on it, and most environmentalists are. So we're not waiting for federal legislation. We're doing everything we can, but we are working as hard as we possibly can be at the state level and at the city level. And I'm rather optimistic. Well, already there has been a lot of recent wins in that area. So we can't possibly sit back and wait. There's a lot of work to do at the state level.
So if you notice, within a month of President Trump's announcement to back out of Paris, and by the way, let me remind everybody, that can't actually be done until 2020. So that's a provisional back out. We will see how that plays out. But within a month, there were two very promising efforts. One is the effort of all these governors and mayors and businesses from the bottom up. And that's very much to be encouraged. The other is ours. These efforts are complementary, no question. But at the end of the day, our goal collectively is to solve the climate problem at the required scale and speed. And to accomplish that, that just won't happen unless it's nation states that lead and unless we get a price on carbon that becomes global. That's why our focus is on national policy and ultimately global policy, but these efforts are entirely complementary.
And of course, it is, at the end of the day, the nation state that sets, international trade policy.
Exactly.
So, yeah. Okay, question right at the back.
Hi, thank you. My name is Dennis Clare. I'm with the Institute for Energy and Climate Strategies, and I'm fortunate to be a scholar here this week. First, I just wanted to comment and thank Ted for mentioning the issues with the Paris Agreement. I spent the last 10 years as a negotiator for small island states, and we got almost nothing we wanted out of Paris. No binding targets, no meaningful finance, nothing on adaptation, very little on loss and damage. So the Paris Agreement really just takes us to the bottom of the...
Can you speak up a bit?
The Paris Agreement just takes us to the bottom of the hill that we need to climb, and hopefully with ideas like these. So with that preface, I'd like to ask what might be the approach, or what you would say to the G77, the developing countries who've always looked for differentiation. Could this idea, well, I'm sure in their minds this might hurt their ability to engage in exports.
Right.
So from the developing countries side, which I've represented, I'm curious what you might say to those countries. And then secondarily,
let's stick with one question, so there's a lot of hands asking. Great question. What about the developing countries who will say it's completely unfair to impose this on them, given that they're in catch-up mode?
So we're not opposing it on them. If you look carefully at our group of founding members, there are 3 top leaders from India. We actually have great hope for India with this plan. And if you think of the context in India, for example, more than any other developing country, they need new energy capacity because something like 300 million Indians lack basic energy. But obviously they want clean energy. They also need a new model of a new social safety net because there's so much endemic corruption. The outgoing central banker of India said upon departing that the most effective way to help low-income Indians is through direct cash payments to the poor through, say, their mobile devices. So pair this, and India, by the way, maybe you don't know, already has a carbon tax. So pair a more aggressive carbon tax in India with dividends. You help the bottom get up. You steer the country towards much cleaner energy sources, and you can incentivize a lot more energy creation. So, I mean, this model works. It needs to be adapted for each specific country, but there's a strong case for this in India. And just to mention one more, in China, right, the leadership is very committed to climate protection, but the #1 priority of the Chinese leadership is to transition to consumer-led economic development. And nothing would do that more rapidly than giving every Chinese citizen a monthly dividend. You would have a mass middle class overnight, and this is actually the only way that China could achieve its environmental and economic goals at the same time. So this policy really can be adapted, whether it's in developed or developing countries.
Right. Got a question at the front over here. And then over there. Where's Nick?
Thank you very much. I agree that, yeah, thank you. I agree, we have a systemic problem and it demands a systemic solution. And I also agree that Paris, as laudable as it was, as aspirational as it was, not in all cases, is that. It's a target, it's an aspiration. What it's not is it's not a mechanism. This seems to me to be a mechanism to achieve this and more. And so my question for somebody on the panel is simply, how do the people in this room, people who have their hands on the levers of influence, move this ball forward? How do we make this happen instead of just getting up and going to the next talk? Because this is the biggest issue of our time. And I say that we have three choices: reduce emissions, adapt to a changing planet, and suffer. We're going to do all three. The question is, what's the mix going to be?
Right.
The more we reduce emissions, the less we're going to have to spend on adaptation, and the less suffering there will be.
Okay, let's ask that question to Nick, perhaps. What do you think people need to actually do when they walk out of this room to make any of this actually happen?
Well, one thing that I think would be useful is, and one of the virtues, I think, of the CLC approach is that it's a realistic approach, right? One of the, I think, unfortunate realities of environmental politics today and politics generally is you have a couple of entrenched sides that are talking past each other and are really kind of missing what's actually practical and what's actually possible. And what's innovative to me about Tett's approach and what the CLC is trying to do is saying, okay, let's be realistic about this. Let's be realistic on the one hand about the energy realities that not just the United States faces, but, you know, as Tett was talking about, India and China and the developing world, where in reality that's where the emission story is going to play out most dramatically, and that's what needs to be gotten right. And so take those energy realities seriously and then say, okay, what's actually practical on a policy front, and understand that you need to get at a minimum 50 plus 1, more like 60, and you need to have buy-in from multiple constituencies. And this approach says, hey, we're trying to solve that problem. And I think having those conversations with people and saying this deadlock stalemate that has been sort of the status quo for quite some time is not acceptable. This is a series of steps that moves us in a direction that might break through that.
Right. Yeah, sure.
One thing I should have said at the beginning is that it took a lot of courage on the part, in particular, of Exxon and the Nature Conservancy to lead here. And specifically in the case of Exxon, they were one of the first companies that signed on. We took a little effort to keep this quiet until we were ready to launch in big bang fashion. But it's important to note that Exxon played a really important behind-the-scenes role in helping some of the other corporate founding members coming on. So to your question, what can you do? Those of you here who represent companies, we want more companies in the coalition. And those of you who are concerned citizens, there are several ways to engage, not only on our website, but I want to highlight there's also a fantastic grassroots organization out there, the Citizens Climate Lobby, that has 300 chapters already across the country in blue states, in red states, devoted to this carbon dividends idea. It's a slightly different variant of it, but it's close enough. It's a great group. It's a way to get involved at the local level.
Question over there.
My name's Don Baker. I'm an antitrust lawyer from Washington who was partially educated in England and reads the Financial Times all the time.
Thank you. You're helping to pay my salary, so thank you.
Anyway, I think this is terrific. I believe incentives are better than regulations and so forth. But I am concerned about what you called as, Gillian, as a Made in America plan. And I wonder, Ted, what you can do to line up some George Schultzes and so forth from around the world to help you carry the thing forward. And secondly, to the extent that this is likely to flow politically faster and better in many other countries, remind Americans of what the carbon adjustment feature, if adopted by a bunch of other countries, may mean for the United States.
Do you have a way to say Climate Leadership Council in French yet?
Le Conseil de leadership du climat.
Still an English word, leadership.
Anyway. Yes. So you'll notice our 11 companies are exceedingly global. In fact, we have a company headquartered in the UK, a company headquartered in France, a company headquartered, Unilever, headquartered in Holland. So we have companies from other key countries. And yes, we want to find leadership in other countries. You have to start somewhere, so we started in the United States, but we will broaden out significantly. And in fact, our next big event is with the World Economic Forum in September in New York, and that will be focused on the international dimensions of this, bringing international leaders to the table. But you know, these guys, both of these organizations are very global, so maybe you could both speak for a moment about, you know, your global involvement. And by the way, one of the reasons why companies want a rationalization like this is because President Trump may say, oh, we're not going to do Paris, but these global companies, they're active in all these countries. And so it doesn't really matter what the United States does. They have to meet the regulations in all of the countries in which they operate. So having a uniform system instead of a hodgepodge of regulations, it's just better business.
Yeah.
Do you guys want to?
Okay. Yeah. Do you want to say something or?
Well, I mean, I would just say, you know, the other big emitters, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, we're on it. So don't worry, sir. We're totally focused.
A question there.
My name is Kenny Field, and I'm from Toronto, Canada. I wish somebody would have been on the panel who could debate perhaps this program and what else can be done with carbon tax and carbon tax monies, because it sounds very good. And by the way, I know your hearts are in the right place. In Canada, by the way, what we have is a federal government who's saying that we have to have a carbon tax, give it to the states, the provinces, and they're going to have to decide what program they want. In Ontario, we have a cap and trade with California, Quebec, British Columbia, et cetera. This is my question for you on this plan. And I don't want to be a negative person, but I ask it this way. If the motivation to reduce our greenhouse gases for the purposes of reducing the suffering from climate change and global warming is going to be to change behavior, if you have a tax on carbon, it's going to increase the price of gasoline, aviation fuel, transportation fuels for trucking, and that's fine. But if you say to people, we're going to give you back all your money, how does that change behavior? Because you're giving back the money to the people who are saying it's going to cost me more in the beginning. That's my first question. The second one is
this.
Okay,
let's keep with one question for the moment. We haven't got much time left. Okay,
the second one's better.
Second question's better? Well, they say you buried the lead, to use a journalistic phrase, but...
Do I get a chance for the second
one? Okay, you have 30 seconds to ask the second question.
Second one is this one. We've learned in history, okay, like sending a man to the moon, that it does cost money for technology and commercialization of different technologies in order to take us off fossil fuels to other fuels that are going to be there. How does this program give any funds to the commercialization of future fuels who have to compete with fossil fuels which have 100 years of history behind them already?
Okay, two great questions, and it's great to have some challenge as well.
So quickly, you know, it's all about carrots and sticks. What this plan would do is it would penalize carbon emissions and it would reward good behavior. People are not getting back the money that they pay. Every American gets the same dividend. Whether you're rich or you're poor, everybody gets the same. It works out that the bottom 70% comes out ahead as a result. Why? Because they have a smaller carbon footprint. But it's a very simple equation. The less you pollute, the better deal you get from this. So it's all about getting the incentives right. And to your second question, look, the reason why we're focusing on dividends is because if you open up the question of where the money goes, it's like a Pandora's box. Republicans will say corporate tax reductions. Democrats and Greens will say give it all to clean tech and energy R&D. And there will be no agreement whatsoever. And the people won't like it because their energy prices will go up and they won't get any benefit. So we're trying to find a middle ground in which all parties can win. So, but to be clear, nothing would incentivize clean tech innovation more than a significant price on carbon.
Right.
Can I just add quickly? The question, though, does remind me, in the US, President Trump's proposed budget proposes draconian cuts across the board for climate science and R&D. This concerns the Nature Conservancy greatly. The country relies on that science investment by the government. So in addition to this kind of program, we also have, as citizens, to champion for such smart investments in science and R&D by the federal government.
Right. Well, sadly, we're out of time. It has been a fascinating and substantive discussion. I've learned a lot, an awful lot. I take away three key things. Firstly, that, as I said at the beginning, Trump's announcement on Paris was certainly not the end of the climate change debate. In many ways, it's been the beginning of a whole new start and probably an accelerant for discussions about how to push forward measures to mitigate climate change. Secondly, though, that it doesn't seem to me that the administration is about to jump on anytime soon, although I hope you're right about the non-trivial aspect of that. And of course, that's going to be an impediment if you are relying on trade policy to push this idea forward. But thirdly, it is remarkable the breadth of the coalition and the different groups that are coming on board now. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot more news on that front going forward. Not least because, I guess my fourth point is that Ted is a fantastically good salesman. He's managed to convince you all. So thank you all very much indeed for your time, and best of luck in pushing it forward. Thank you.